Hello, welcome to episode 11. We are still at the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, and Sister Denise and I will now be discussing what is the end of chapter 2 so that we can round off this fascinating topic as to what the yoga of knowledge really means. I hope you have been enjoying the series as much as I have thus far. Sister Denise, welcome back.
Thank you.
We've gone in detail through verse 62 and 63, and the next aspect that I'd like to take up is what's contained in verse 64. Sister Denise, verse 64 speaks of the elimination of desire and hatred, and I like the way the one is played off against the other, implying that the one leads to the other. Okay, and I'd like to know what it means when God says to Arjuna, he who is controlled by the self, by self-restraint, attains tranquility. And once again, capital S has been used.
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, let's look at the capital S, and I think that the translator has decided to put a capital S because it refers to the awakened soul who's in its higher state of consciousness. And you know, there are people who subscribe to the concept that the soul becomes the Supreme Soul. So normally in English language, when you capitalize a word, like self, you're talking about the self as not a normal human self, but something much higher. So he might be thinking that the self is God, or he might be thinking that the self in its higher state is something special to distinguish it from its ordinary state. So these could be two reasons why he would choose to capitalize the word self. Self-restraint is again managing the feelings, and one is urged and provoked and compelled to do things which are against our better interests, and most people are not able to manage that, not able to restrain it. Sometimes yes, but a lot of times no. And what the Gita is saying is we want to reach a stage where we always judicious, always very conscious of what we're doing, always doing everything deliberately, so that we're not under the compulsion of an emotion or a provocation. Then you can be enlightened. Or said to be enlightened.
Sister Denise, I see the theme that runs across verses 64, 65, 66, 67 is that of self-control. The words in verse 67 reads, when the mind runs after the wandering senses, then it carries away one's understanding as the wind carries away a ship on waters. We'll come to the symbology of that later, but self-control appears to be an important part of one's spiritual journey. What does this mean to you?
You know, if you look at the analogy of the ship being carried by the wind, there's another layer of meaning of that, because in traditional Indian thinking, your life is compared with a boat, and the wind is the emotion. The water is, of course, your subconscious. And so the boat of your life is carried on the surface of your subconscious. The boat is the part that's visible, and you're on a journey going to your destiny, your destination. But the winds of emotions can take you somewhere totally different. If you have self-control, what does that mean is that the intellect is given dominance within the arena of the soul, whereas normally it's the mind, which means the emotions, and the mind is totally connected to the sense perceptions on the outside and to the subconscious on the inside. And so these are very, very powerful energies, and the point, I think, of the Gita is really to make the intellect strong so that the intellect decides what happens rather than the emotions.
What do you understand by the words, in tranquility the cessation of all sorrows is born for him? Tranquility.
You can say tranquility, or another expression that you find in addiction recovery vocabulary is serenity. And serenity and tranquility are pretty much synonymous. Tranquility means that you remain even-tempered, you are calm, you are quiet, even though there may be all sorts of things going on to push you. But here again, the way that you become like that is, it's a decision. It's a determination. But, you know, there is, along with Raja Yoga, there is also Hatha Yoga. And the difference between Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga is, with Hatha Yoga, you oblige the self to be in a steady stage, whereas in Raja Yoga you bring the self to a point where it's able and willing to do that in and of itself. So this is why the word Hatha Yoga means yoga by force, and yoga by force is not so desirable, because wherever you have a force you have a reaction to that force. So as soon as your Hatha Yoga practice is not happening, then whatever it was the situation is what happens. With Raja Yoga, you want to bring the different aspects of consciousness under your dominion, but it's more like they become willing to go along with you rather than you do it by oppression, suppression, repression, and force. Therefore, when you're in the practice of Raj Yoga, when you let up, it's still running, you see, so that you use a certain amount of inner will, but you're reshaping the sanskaras, you're reshaping your patterns inside so that they continue and it's sustainable, which is the big difference between the two kinds of yoga.
I see that in verse 66 there is a link drawn between peace and happiness, and the words are, in him who does not concentrate there is no peace. How can there be happiness for him who is not peaceful? And before this, the danger of being uncontrolled and not having any concentration is raised. How do you apply this in your practical life?
Where happiness is the goal, happiness, as I mentioned on previous occasions, is not an emotion of happiness that is like euphoric or something like this, but happiness is where you have whatever you need in terms of physical wealth, health, relationships, and everything is going well. That is considered to be happiness. A happy life has all of those components. And you don't have to be in a euphoric state all the time as a peak experience. So a happy life is where everything is going nicely. Now, if you do not have peace, it means you're discontent, dissatisfied, and you're still operating on the basis of desire, because peace is connected with being desireless. Peace in the sense that there is three components, if you will. The Hindi word or the Sanskrit word is shanti, and shanti means silence, it means stillness, and it means peace. So where the soul is still, you're content. You do not have desires, and desires are the things that create the movement that prevent the stillness, you see. So until you have reached that stage of peace, where there is stillness, silence, contentment, then you can be happy with what you have. And you will perform the right kind of actions. actions on the basis of discontent, they will actually lead to more dissatisfaction.
How do you understand the following words? The man of restraint is awake in that which is night for all beings. The time in which all beings are awake is night for the sage who sees. That's a very curious verse.
It's a very beautiful verse because awake really means aware. So people who are hedonists, they are totally awake to sense perception. And the sage is not awake to sense perception. The sage is awake to what you can perceive through the third eye. The sage is awake to what the laws of spirituality are and what you need to understand in order to be really an illuminated, enlightened being. So it's making that contrast.
Once again, the dangers of delusion and self-deception are highlighted. This is a recurring theme throughout chapter 2. Why is it re-emphasized in verse 67 and in verse 68, where it says, "Therefore, O Arjuna, the wisdom of one whose senses are withdrawn from the objects of senses, that wisdom stands firm."
The thing is that you can hear all this and you can say, yes, I agree with it. But then comes this but. And I think it's because there's so much attachment to the feelings. And all the way through the conversation in the Gita, and here we're just at the second chapter, and so we have another 16 chapters to go, where he's going to be taken through many, many different terrains. But you see, you know, you understand, you get it for a moment and then you lose it. And so you have to be reminded again and again. Another aspect is that you're going along, you're making some progress, you're reaching a certain stage, and then you get some success. When you get success, you think, yes, I've got it. And you fall into delusion again very quickly with success. So with failure you go into despondency, and with success you go into this delusion, this sense of I'm greater than what I really am. And so there has to be that reminder again and again and again. Be clear, do not fall into these mirages.
Sister Denise, the danger of being filled with desires is highlighted again and again and again in chapter 2, and I see the words again pop up from the page in verse 70, which is almost the end of chapter 2. Why is this continually drawn to Arjuna's attention, to our attention? And practically, how does one not be sucked into the various desires that we have, no matter how small or big?
In order not to have desires, you have to have something that's better than a desire.
Which is?
Which is God. Because when you have God, when you receive God, when you experience God, the totality of God, that completely fulfills the soul. Desires occur when the soul is depleted. So the problem is, which we haven't actually got to the part of the contemplation on God yet, because we're still at the stage where he has to be aware of himself as a spiritual being and control his the energies of desire which arise because he's spiritually depleted. And so you cannot overcome emptiness by telling it to go away. It's just not like that. You can only overcome emptiness with fullness.
Denise, I want to interject there. One line of practice that I've seen is that you get individuals who, to get away from a desire, starve themselves from the object of their desire.
Oh, it's still in here, isn't it?
Okay, so starving yourself, and by that I mean, if you want chocolates, you say, I'm not buying myself any, because then I want the desire to go away.
But
That's not
you're
it.
dreaming of them.
You're dreaming of the
It'll
chocolates.
come more.
So then, instead of instead of seeing this small chocolate this size, you see a slab of chocolate. The desires become worse.
Yeah.
Okay, so the hunger grows.
Yeah. And then you go into the binge stage, you see. So again, we come back into addictions, because desire and addiction is pretty close.
Yeah.
So what happens with the people who are trying to give up is they will hold themselves with force for a bit, and then they won't be able to hold it any longer. Something will happen to trigger it, which they won't be able to hold with force, and then it goes into a binge.
Sister Denise, the practical reality of desires is that it emerges in you, the thought emerges in you, I want this. Okay? And then on the other side, it is said in the Bhagavad Gita, he whom all desires enter and who remains unmoved attains peace. Not so the man who is full of desire. Peace is, compared to what you can get from a desire, appears boring. Peace is no longer a valuable commodity in the world that we live in. Peace is an absence of fighting in the home. Peace is not. Peace doesn't even have a name attached to it nowadays. It's not. Yeah, I'm peaceful, but this is like boring. Too much peace is so not good. I want something more. Okay.
Well, so this is why I said earlier that until and unless you actually have that flow between yourself and God, you cannot get anything which is better than a desire. Or an unfulfilled desire is going to eat you. And this is why, again, I go back to addiction recovery. If you wish to become free from your psychological and physical dependence on a drug, you have to have something that has more power, and that only is the experience of contact with God. Because when you have contact with God, all of your emptiness disappears, and so desires disappear. You can't make desires go away by trying to control them. It doesn't work.
The word ego is mentioned in verse 71, being free from ego specifically. Tell us the role that ego plays in one's spiritual journey.
I think of ego as a substitute for the self. So when a person has lost themselves or lost the ability to fuse with their own soul, lost the ability to be who they really are, this is when they come under the influence of matter, and then they will build. Ego is also called false ego, so they will build a substitute self, and then they will fuse with that. And that substitute self is very fragile, very brittle, and any attack on that is an attack on you. So ego, the sign of ego is you're very reactive, and you take things as insults very quickly, very easily.
Sister Denise, we are now at the last verse of chapter 2, where it reads, this is the divine state, Arjuna. Having attained this, he is not deluded. Fixed in it, even at the hour of death, he reaches the bliss of God. That expression is very attractive. The bliss of God. Does that mean God is experiencing the bliss, or the human being will be experiencing the bliss once you're in front of God? Whose bliss is it?
God dwells in a state of bliss. And when you go to God, or you see that, and you feel that, that bliss comes into you, and you are totally, completely at one with God and ready to let go of everything, because there isn't anything better than that bliss.
The attainment of the divine state. The divine state. How would you define that?
Well, here we are in an earthly state, a material state. So a divine state. You see, as I mentioned before, God exists in a state of bliss, which is a very, very extraordinary state that most people can never get anywhere near. But if you do whatever is necessary, and if you have deep love for God, all these things, all these steps will bring you closer and closer to that, so that it says, you know, at your hour of death, you will just merge into the bliss. And you'll experience yourself just fusing with God. Of course, a soul cannot become God, but that's the experience. You just go into the bliss, and that is it. It's the ultimate experience.
Is that a permanent state, Sister Denise, or is it what you call a peak experience?
Well, when it's at the hour of your death, and you die in that, and time stops when you die for you, it then becomes permanent. Of course, you then reincarnate when the right time comes, but when everything stops and you are in that bliss, what could be better? Nothing could be better. So that is really the aim of people who do a spiritual practice. And I think that why a person would be drawn to make a decision to live a spiritual life is because they get a bit of a taste of that bliss. Because it's possible for God to touch you and give you a feeling that, okay, this is the bliss of God. Now, if you want this, this and this and this is what you have to do. But once you've tasted it, you want it.
It's like an hors d'oeuvre.
Oh, it's the publicity, it's the advertising. It's the taste,
Okay.
you know. And I liken it again to what motivates a drug addict, because the drug addict wants the high, which takes the drug addict away from all of the inability to manage feelings, inability to manage their life, inability to manage their relationships. Their whole life is a mess. And so they will go into the drug, which is an artificial bliss, which leaves you chaotic and in very deep low. But the bliss of God is real. And it's so extraordinary, it's so beautiful, you don't want anything else, you see. And that is, once a person has a little bit tasted that or had a vision of it or something like this, you go for that, because you know that in comparison with that, all these other things are nothing, you know. And then you get this state, which is often mentioned in the Brahma Kumari's teachings of Raj Yoga, and that is the state of vairagya. Vairagya is a state of kind of detachment, disinterest, where you realize that all of these temptations, they're nothing, they're insipid. Doesn't do it for you.
Sister Denise, we've come to the end of chapter 2, okay? It took us much longer to get to the end of this chapter than I anticipated, which means that the message that God is giving to his son is extremely deep and powerful. What do you want the reader to know about the yoga of knowledge?
I think one interesting point about the yoga of knowledge is that it's the first teaching of God. And, you know, the next chapter that we're going to come into is yoga of action, which is a much lower stage. So it means God is going to give you the best first, and then if you're not up for that, he's going to give you something a little easier, something a little second best. That is like, okay, if you can't manage this, then you can have that and that and that. But it is said, you know, the knowledgeful soul is loved by God. The one who is able to really take the knowledge of God, work with that knowledge, realize God, and actually make themselves the good follower, the good student, the good child of such a extraordinary being. And the reward of that is, of course, the bliss of God, the prize of the kingdom of the world for 21 births. But, you know, all of these go a little bit beyond the range of most people. So then subsequent chapters of the Gita, we look at things that are maybe a little bit easier, but again and again he will come back to this initial offer that he hands to Arjuna. And this is why I think the second chapter of the Gita is the one that is the most studied, the most revered, and the most considered really the favorite, because everything is in there. This is, I think, why it took us such a long time to really go through everything.
Okay, Sister Denise, thank you so much. Well, there you have it, brothers and sisters, the end of chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. It's been a long conversation that Sister Denise and I were having on this particular chapter, but this is the beginning of the conversation between Sri Krishna and Arjuna, and it is necessary to look at it in depth to realize what is the message that God wants his children to know. So I hope you have taken deep benefit from it. And like Sister Denise shared in previous episodes, the Bhagavad Gita is not theory. The question that you should be asking yourself is, how are you applying this in your daily life? Not how you understand, but how you apply it. So thank you so much for joining us this episode, and we will definitely see each other again for chapter 3. Thank you and goodbye.